Diamond, Diamond.
A precious gem of the most valuable kind. When pure, it is clear.
Diamond, Diamond.
A family name bringing traditions of love, hard work, and moral values.
This is the Diamond Education Podcast with my mom and dad, Jon and Kellee, England.
This is part one of our conversation with Andrew Pudewa, the founder of IEW. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Diamond Education Podcast with Jon and Kellee England, your hosts, where we are here to help you find the most valuable education for your child. And we're excited today. We have Andrew Pudewa. Andrew, I was going to butcher your last name. I'm sorry. Pudewa. So we have Andrew Pudewa on our program today.
We're excited to have Andrew on with us. Andrew Pudewa is the founder and principal speaker for the Institute of Excellence in Writing, IEW. Presenting around the world, he addresses issues related to teaching, writing, thinking, spelling, and music with clarity, insight, practical experience, and humor. His seminars for parents, students, and teachers have helped transform many a reluctant writer and have equipped educators with powerful tools to dramatically improve student skills. Although he is a graduate of the Talent Education Institute in Japan, the Suzuki method, and holds a certificate of child brain development, his best endorsement is from a young Alaskan boy who called him the funny man with the wonderful word. He and his wonderful, heroic wife, Robin, have homeschooled their 7 children and are now proud grandparents of 15, making their home in northeastern Oklahoma's beautiful green country. Andrew, welcome to the Diamond Education Podcast.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you today.
So, Andrew, we always like to start off with there's a couple questions we always have in our podcast. And the first one is, what is education?
Ooh, well, I guess if you look at the Latin root, there's a significant difference. Educare essentially means to draw out, whereas instruction is derived from instrua, which is a verb to pile upon. And I think that sets the context for that question. You know, a lot of people have nice little platitudes, you know, education is the lighting of a fire, or whatever. I would, I guess, define a good education as something that helps the student maximize their potential to do good in the world. And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people who operate in the larger education world think in that way. Yeah. I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson, and you know, when he says, you know, if you don't strive to do good in the world, the consequences for everyone are horrible. And we live in such a self-centered universe, and it's all about me and my success, and I will make my self successful, or I'm going to get what I want. And this is a very disordered way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And so I would go back to kind of a more classical definition, which would be education should be about the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. Not two words that you find very often in the general public forum.
Yeah.
The question after that would be, well, how do you cultivate wisdom and virtue? And then you get into a second level of philosophical discussion, and ultimately end up with some technical aspects of how to do that. But I would start at that point for any parents looking at their kids. You know, what are your desires for this child? You know, do you want them to have material and financial and, you know, superficial prosperity, or do you want them to grow up with the deep level of happiness that comes when you're able to truly serve your fellow human beings and God?
Yeah.
Oh, I love that, Andrew.
Yeah. That's really awesome. So part of our religious beliefs, we love the term educare and that Latin term, because we do feel like we are drawing out a remembrance of who we are and who we were before we came here as children of God. And so that's excellent. Thank you so much. One of the things that we're new homeschoolers and, just starting our second year. And
Congratulations. Welcome to the team.
Oh, it was scary, but like now I would never go back. Like
No.
it's been an amazing, fun journey. So yeah.
It's been awesome. And one of the very first things that we found was IEW, the Institute for Excellence in Writing, and you and your work. And we started listening to some of your podcasts, and we've listened to your conference talks and a lot of those. And one that has really stood out to us is your talk on However Imperfectly. So what was the genesis of the name of However Imperfectly for that talk?
Yeah, so I wrote this talk when I had reached this point where I estimated that I had been teaching for about 30 years. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write this talk. What have I learned in 30 years? Because, hopefully you've learned something in 3 decades.
Yeah.
And I've taught in a lot of scenarios. We've homeschooled most of our kids for most of the time, but I was a music teacher for the first half of my adult life. I've taught in schools. I've, run around. I've met thousands and thousands of children. So I came up with this talk, and one of the points on the talk is that it's really about process rather than product. That's point number 2. And I have always loved a particular G.K. Chesterton quote. I don't know if you're familiar with Chesterton, but I always recommend Chesterton to everybody. But he made a statement that is a little bit perplexing to some people, which is anything worth doing is worth doing badly. Or sometimes people will transliterate that and say anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. And, it kind of goes against our whole idea, which is, well, you should teach what you're good at and you should do what you're good at. But he frames this differently and says, well, what's worth doing? And if it's worth doing, then you're not going to be good at it when you start.
Yeah.
Right. It's okay to not do things well, especially when you're starting at something. Yeah. And, I think as a kid, I had a little bit of this perfectionist tendency that you see in children. Maybe I still do. And I don't like it when I'm not good at stuff. But over the years, I've come to realize that, what I have done with, a motive to serve children. I've done it with, I think, a degree of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, willingness to learn, teachability, a modicum of humility. And in doing that, I've done things poorly, but they were very worth doing. So I thought, well, poorly, it's just imperfectly. I'm not perfect. I've not taught anything perfectly. But however imperfectly I have done it, it has been good for both me and for my students. So that's kind of where the title came from.
Yeah, and I've really liked that personally because in a way it's freeing to think about that. I have conversations with my wife all the time about, we did the best we could with the knowledge we had, and as we gain more knowledge, we can do better. And so that's something I really, really enjoyed. So,
well, no, and I love that, Andrew, because even when we started homeschooling, it's scary. And you're like, I don't know if I can do it because I don't know everything, but it's been amazing as we've done it. We've learned with them, and that's been okay. Like, basic concepts and grammar rules and everything. And I'm not a mathematician. I struggle at math, but we can sit down and figure it out together, me and the child,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I love that idea.
Well, I've also noticed that in the world of teaching, sometimes people who have struggled to learn something themselves make better teachers than people who are just always naturally good at something. We see this in writing all the time. I meet so many moms who say, I feel like I've always known how to do this. I always got A's. I did well in college. I helped my boyfriend write his papers. Now he's my husband. but I don't remember learning how to do it. I just could always do it. And then they have to teach this kind of reluctant writer 10-year-old, and he's not getting it. And there's that frustration there. Whereas someone who's kind of had to struggle all the way along can often understand the breaking of a complex thing into smaller pieces and then teach that and cultivate that more effectively in children. So that's, I guess, a little bit of the silver lining of being not so good at something is you have to struggle to learn, and in doing so, you learn to teach that thing to others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the example is huge for them as well, right? Mom's learning too.
Oh yeah.
So your first point we related on your however imperfectly. It's hard not to do to your children, right?
What was done to them.
What was done to them. Can you explain what you mean by that point to our listeners, and we'll discuss?
Well, we come into teaching, whether it's a job of teaching and you've actually been through, an education degree or some kind of thing like that purportedly taught you to do it, or more likely in the homeschool world, we start teaching our own kids, or we've learned something and we start teaching that thing without all the baggage of educational philosophy and stuff that comes along. And so the most formative impact on our teaching of other people is our experience of being taught. We can't escape that. And even if you go to college for 4 years, you still have before that, 10, 11, 12, 13 years of what happened to you while you were between 6 and 18 in terms of schooling. And so you almost just default. Well, that's what was done to me. That's what I should do to these students. Without having the ability to step back and say, was that thing which was done to me the best thing or even a good thing?
Yeah.
Is there something better? It's kind of like, fish don't know that the sky exists because they can't get out of the water. We're in this steeped world of what education in the 20th and 21st century is, and it's really hard to see above or beyond that. So part of what I have worked to do is just try to help break people's paradigm and say, guess what? There are all sorts of ways that people have done education throughout history that are very different than our K-12 public model system that almost everyone conforms to today.
Yeah. No, I love that. I actually, the other day I was driving past our old elementary school that our kids went to. And I just had that thought like, oh, our world has opened up, and how grateful I am that my kids, and I still, Andrew, get caught in that, regiment, public. I have to no, bring it back. Like yesterday, my kids the littles just wanted to play, and they were having a good imaginative play session all together, and being like, okay, we can do that part later, or because this is important for them right now, things like that. But just driving past that school and realizing there's so much out there for my children, and they have so many interests and so much to learn. And it's not regimented into what the government says they should learn, it's what God wants us to learn. And it's a beautiful journey. So I love that. So
I've been particularly fascinated over the past year or two with biographies of great people who are extremely articulate, obviously well-educated, accomplished amazing things, and yet didn't go to school. Like in times of history where there was no school. Men like Frederick Douglass. I recently read a biography of the father of Alexander Dumas, who was half nobleman, born of a black slave woman in what is now Haiti. No school, and yet the excerpts of his letters to his wife are so incredibly eloquent you're just envious. I couldn't write English. I couldn't write language like that. Of course, he wrote in French, but you just wonder, like, how did this person who had no schooling, as we would think of it, become so incredibly brilliant and articulate? I just started a biography of Catherine of Siena, you know, a Catholic saint from the early middle ages, no schools, especially for girls, and yet she became a doctor of the church. She was one of this incredibly well educated, and you know, her family was, you know, lower middle class artisans. So I'm just interested to know if it's possible that most kids would actually come out more well educated if they just didn't go to school the way we do it. Because there have been lots of times in places where there were very well educated, articulate, competent, critically thinking people who just didn't go to school.
Yeah.
So
Well, and you find even a lot of the, you know, people that are successful in our society, a lot of them didn't do college, or, you know, it was just they had an interest in something and really developed that and went with it, you know.
So I think there's a relationship between freedom and genuine learning. And the corollary of that there would be an opposite relationship between suppressed freedom and genuine learning. So
absolutely.
And you already mentioned this a little bit with the second point of your talk being that the process being more important than the product. We recently had Adam Hailstone, who is one of the founders of Williamsburg Learning, on our podcast with us, and he talked about how even like teaching a child how to think as opposed to what to think is such an important thing. So what is some of the dangers of putting the product above the process in learning that parents might run into?
Well, you know, we should look probably at the big picture of the history of education. So once upon a time, there was God in education. In fact, if you go back far enough, there weren't even schools that operated outside of the authority of the church, right? So the universal church, until the Protestant Reformation, throughout the whole West, essentially there was faith, and the church had authority over education. Education then would produce people, and people would then create culture. They would write books and build buildings and draw pictures and the stuff of life. And the whole purpose of that, kind of, you know, exceptions, of course, but the generally acknowledged purpose of culture was to cultivate faith. So it was a positive loop. Then you had the Protestant Reformation, and one of the side effects of that, and took a couple hundred years, was you could start your own school. You could not only start your own religion, you could start your own school. Well, you know, and you look back in this country, we had Harvard, Yale, Princeton. What were they originally? Schools of divinity, right? To raise distinctly Christian leaders for a distinctly Christian country. But now what are they? They're not just not Christian, they're hostile to traditional Judeo-Christian values and beliefs, and getting more so. And so schools became untethered from authority. They became their own authority, and under the guise of academic freedom. But now we see almost the reversal of that. There's no accountability to a higher authority. This is a very dangerous situation for everyone, but I think for education in particular. So when they kicked God out of schools, it created a vacuum. And you have to have a God. If you don't have a real God, you got to have an idol. So the first idol that really came in was this progressivism idea. And this was, as you know, from reading Gatto and DeMille and some of the things you're familiar with, this was the industrial model. If we could just do the same thing in the same way with everybody, we would get the same result. And then we'd have a nice, controllable mass of predictable, obedient factory workers, voters, and consumers who would do and say and vote exactly the way they were told. And then you give people two false choices, Pepsi or Coke, you have freedom. You don't. And so that industrial model was very, very strong from, the late early 1900s, depending where you were, all the way until probably the 60s is when it started to fall apart. And then you got this new wave of progressivism, which was, well, creativity is what's really the most important thing. If it's creative, it's good. If it's good, it's creative. And how dare you make a child memorize anything? How dare you teach them how to write an essay according to a plan? No, just give them opportunity to express themselves, and this will somehow help them get better at stuff. Well, that failed very miserably as well. And you see the decline of basic reading, writing, and calculation skills starting in the late 60s, early 70s. And it's been a continuous decline since then until the present day. So around the 80s, 90s, you saw the kind of the kicking out of the god of creativity. The new idol became standards. So now we have to have standards. We're going to say everybody, by merit of being a certain age, must be able to read and write and do math and have this level of general knowledge. Well, that would be great if all human beings were exactly the same.
Yeah.
But, and that's touching on, another 0.3, which is all kids are different. All you have to do is hang out with 2 of them for a short time and you realize, wow.
And
so
we have 5 kids, and we totally know that every child is the exact same. Like they all did the exact same thing at the exact same. No.
Yeah. So when we started age segregating children and then attaching standards to that, and you can go all the way back to, the Bush era, No Child Left Behind, and then you had the, Obama era, the Common Core state standards. There's been several iterations of this idea. If we just tell everybody what they must be able to do at a certain age, well, then the schools will have to do this. Well, guess what? The schools don't. They fail because some of the kids are different than other of the kids. And so, well, they can't allow that. So they lower the standards a little bit. They still fail. They lower the standards a little bit more. They still fail. They lower the standards a little bit more. And then someone comes along and says, well, the reason everything's so bad is because we have these horribly low standards, but we can't really raise them because there's too many people who would fail. So we have to make them increasingly vague and fuzzy. And if you want to read vague and fuzzy, go read the Common Core State Standards Initiative Language Arts for pick your grade. There's almost nothing that's concrete enough to say, yeah, I could teach the kid to do this and know that if he did it or not. And so that's all died. And so we've actually removed standards as the god of education and replaced it with technology. So technology is the new god of education. If you give every kid a Chromebook and a tablet, and you hook them up to the internet, and you give them access to unlimited information, oh, this is going to solve all our educational problems. And by the way, it'll be very efficient because we can eliminate the problem of paper. So nobody actually has to carry around a big, heavy book. No one has to learn the tedious task of making letters and writing sentences on paper. Nobody does that anymore. We're all going to be typing, and we're all going to be talking to our computers in no time at all. In fact, we're not going to have to write anything because AI is just going to take our little outline and, construct lovely prose that will be acceptable to everyone because everyone's artistic sensibility has been wiped out. So you see this, especially in public education, you see this tremendous push to get technology lower and lower and lower, down to the point where Los Angeles Unified has to buy an iPad for every first grader in the whole district. And it's so ridiculous because every bit of research that's out there shows clearly in black and white in peer-reviewed journal that giving kids computers does not improve basic skills. If anything, it degrades basic skills. But idolatry is idolatry, and that's where we're at. And so we believe that technology will solve all problems. And hopefully at some point, someone wakes up and says, well, that didn't work. I guess we should go back to looking at what people used to do a couple hundred years ago when they were very well educated. But that might involve bringing in transcendental qualities like goodness, truth, and beauty back into schools, which would not be tolerated by the powers that be. So we're kind of in
A
what
death
appears to
spiral
be
almost.
a hopeless situation in many cases.
And that was actually one of your points that you made there with in regards to I just lost what I was going to say. The idea that, we're relying on technology for all knowledge and truth, right? And after so long, if you don't have that information in your head, you might not even have the ability to ask the question of the technology of what does this mean? And that scares me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I use the example of, okay, let's say you are a person who does not know when the American Civil War happened.
Right.
Well, you just ask your phone, Siri, when did the American Civil War happen? And Siri will tell you the exact day on which it started and ended. So the argument there is, well, why do you need to know dates like that if you can just find out very quickly and easily? Like, why burden a child with excess stuff they have to memorize? But the problem is, as you said, if you know less and less and less, pretty soon you don't even know there was an American Civil War, and you wouldn't be able to ask the question, when did it happen? And then you would be suffering a profound level of ignorance, which I would argue makes you much more controllable by people and forces in the world that like to control and exploit hapless, unsuspecting students who are about to become hapless and unsuspecting adults who don't know much at all. And that is very dangerous. Jefferson said, if a society hopes to, I'm paraphrasing, if a society hopes to remain free and ignorant, they are hoping for something which never has been and never will be. So our freedom to do good in the world, unhindered by those who hate good, is very, very dependent on our freedom to pursue opportunity, to prepare and then act. And so I look at it as really a battle of cosmic proportions, and the destiny of souls hangs in the balance. And it's easy to kind of become hopeless about the situation. But then you look and say, well, okay, look at all the alternative education that's popping up. Look at the classical charter school movement. It's exploding. The Catholic schools that aren't closing are going classical because they have to differentiate or die. Public schools shrinking, that's going to continue. Homeschooling exploding, especially among the minority populations. In fact, the biggest growth in homeschooling 2021 was in the Black population in America. And that's not accidental. People know what's going on, and the bad guys are getting a little careless, I would say, tipping their hand too soon, which often happens.
Yeah, thank goodness.
And I think one of the things that we can even look back in history, because you mentioned the Protestant Revolution and the Reformation that came with that. Well, the thing that preceded that was the fact that just this one class of people, the priests, knew how to read the scriptures, right? And then they started translating them into people's everyday language, and they began being able to read. And then all of a sudden you have things like the Renaissance happening with this explosion of art and science and music and all these beautiful, wonderful things. And I think that I'm a little hopeful that we may have another one of these explosions, because I do think that we've had not necessarily an inability to have information, but we have now this explosion of different ways that children learn, and businesses popping up actually to try and meet those different ways of, hey, this is a much more active way of learning, or things like that I've found fascinating. So
yeah, it is very hopeful. And it is a case where either things have to change very radically, and we are on the beginning of the cusp of facilitating that, or it's going to be a pretty rough century for you and your kids and their kids. I'm going to die soon. So,
No, you can't.
but I'm sure you still worry about your grandchildren and your children and what they're going to face.
Yeah, every day I look at them and think, what kind of world is this going to be 20, 40, 50 years from now? And I think, that reinvigorates me to keep doing what I'm doing, because I know for a fact that our approach to teaching writing, our approach to education, the philosophical underpinnings really does help move kids from that. You said it earlier, the what to do and the what to think and the dictates that institutions very often try to put on them, into the how to think and how to know what to do. And so I'm very pleased. All my daughters are doing a superbly great job homeschooling their kids. So that does give me hope. But they're a very small number, and we need to grow that number rapidly before the demographic kills us.
Absolutely. And I do think it is growing rapidly. There are a lot of people. It's just getting that faith in people that they can do it, however imperfectly, right?
Yep, however imperfectly.
We're all down here doing the best we can, right?
And I think that one of the things that people need is faith in themselves. A lot of these moms worry that, am I harming my child as they begin to homeschool? I mean, we've had conversations with family members who are just starting, and we're only a year and a half into this. And so, but this idea that they're beginning a new journey and they're worried, like, what am I doing to my child? Is it going to work out? And they're really, really worried about that. And so anyway, I think that they need to have faith in themselves. I think Sam Sorbo talks about that as well. It's like, you can do this.
Absolutely. And I tell you, if any parent actually just went to the school where their kids are and spent an entire day sitting in classes, looking at the books, seeing what's going on, seeing how incredibly inefficient the system is in terms of the use of time. And I think that's part of what happened in 2020 was kids went distance learning. And for the first time, parents can look at the teacher and hear what they're saying and see, this virtual classroom. And some of them are shocked. Like, that's what's actually going on in my kid's school. I had no idea. So, I always tell parents, spend a whole day in the school. And if you can do that and come out and say, yep, this is a great environment for my kid. I totally like it. The teacher is good. The things they're reading and talking about. Okay, all power to you. But if you don't do that and leave your kids in that environment, well, that's kind of irresponsible, because you're operating totally out of ignorance. And the whole system wants to brainwash you and say, oh, well, you're not qualified. You're not qualified to actually teach your children. And, that's probably the biggest lie that people, will accept. Like, well, I can read and write and do math, and I have a degree in blah, blah, but I don't have training in education. Well, honestly, if I were going to start a school, the first prerequisite is that you don't have a degree in elementary education.
So you couldn't hire Jon?
No, I
don't know. I might hire Jon, but I have absolutely no desire to start a school. So, but my wife has a degree in elementary education. It's almost like a handicap. You've got 4 more years of this programming that's coming in, that the institution is the only capable. And that's why I love reading these biographies of people who are completely outside any educational system at all, and yet became truly great people who made huge contributions to the world. So I find it so interesting.
Yeah. And I think going back, to the Christianity, and that God has a mission for all of us, and that bringing out is that we're all here and we all have a mission, and it's really discovering that mission, because all those people you're reading, it's their mission, it's who they're supposed to become. And
Paul, even in the New Testament, talks about, we're all the body of Christ, and, the eye can't say to the foot or whatever that you can't, I don't need you. Right. We all we are all different, and do all have these different talents that God gave to us to help promote his kingdom. And if we put everybody into this one system saying, hey, this is how you need to be, that doesn't work with God's plan, because that's not how God made us. He made us different on purpose.
Which is the sort of diversity we should be celebrating and cultivating. And the horrible irony is that this agenda to promote diversity awareness in schools and businesses and society is actually just narrowing everyone's so much. But I don't want to get too political. This is an education podcast.
Yes,
it is. We joke that politics is our new sport. So
dangerous one. Injuries happen.
It is.
It does.
Yeah. So
one of the things that I think, and you've talked about your point 3, which is that all children are different. And so I'm actually going to skip on to point 4, if you're okay with that in your talk, which is this idea about that progressive education isn't actually progress, right? I recently listened to a podcast called Soul to Story, and it's just a 6-part podcast talking about the rise of basically whole word reading versus phonics, and how, in whole word reading, and this idea that, reading is just magic, and kids just magically know how to read. If we just provide them the right environment, they'll learn how to read, versus a phonics focus that is, no, there's actually a logic to how our words are put together. And actually, I'm looking at a stack of books that our computer's sitting on, and one of them is The Logic of English, right?
Yes,
which is that foundation of, these phonics have are building these words, and they have a reason why the A says this and in this situation, but it says this other sound in another situation. And so can you talk a little bit about that idea of how progressive education, it doesn't actually mean progress?
Right. Well, progressive is a word that has been hijacked, very much like pro quality of life has hijacked the idea of pro-life. And so if an as adult, you want to have a better quality of life, well, you better get rid of this baby before it's born, or it's going to mess up your life. I mean, that's the opposite meaning, right?
Right.
And I think we see this here. Progressive does not mean progress, because if it did, then you would be happy with the results. But no one is happy with the results of the last 50 years of education. So, you have to, I guess, get the idea that progress simply means new. And when there's a new idea, what that does is it allows people to make money and take control. So if you're the superintendent of a school district and you want to come in and change something, you can come in with a new approach, but you don't have any guarantee that this is going to be better than what you were doing, but you can kind of force everyone to do it. And then you're going to leave and go be the superintendent of a bigger school district, having said, yes, I implemented this new program. And nowhere along the line is there accountability to say, did it actually improve students' reading, writing, math, general knowledge, happiness, however you want to measure things. Same thing with, these curriculums that people create. There's not a lot of money in saying, well, let's do things the way we did them 100 years ago. There's profit in, well, let's come up with this entirely new way, whether it makes sense or not. We can sell it if we can convince you that new is better. So, in that point, I'm just suggesting to parents, don't buy into this idea that just because it's different or new, or because it's a change, that it will be better. You can just look at history. A lot of times, new or change was not better. It was worse. And so, to the degree that people still have a tiny amount of awareness of history, they should be able to make this connection.
Yeah.
But, part of the plan to isolate people and make them more controllable is to gradually eliminate their awareness of the past, so they can't have the wisdom to make judgments in the present. And we see the extreme portrayal of that in Orwell's 1984, where all history has been completely eliminated, and the Ministry of Truth puts out the propaganda that everyone has to accept because they've got absolutely no way to challenge it with any knowledge of anything else. So, I think that that's kind of where we're at. So when we have an opportunity to say, hey, let's examine what was the education tradition for a very, very long time that seemed to work very well, as you mentioned earlier, brought in the Renaissance, brought in the Enlightenment, as the human population on Earth expanded, technology exploded. Quality of life for everyone on the whole planet is better than it was 100 years ago. Well, if we'd like to continue that, we shouldn't look at just changing things. We should look and say, well, what were the good things that brought us to where we are in terms of this being a better place and having better opportunity in life than people in the past? But the focus more is on, well, there's all these problems right now. We have to come up with a new idea to solve all these problems. Well, like you said, every new method of teaching reading falls short of the one by which everyone has used to learn to read for hundreds of years.
Yeah. And Andrew, to add on to that, it's interesting you say that, because a few years ago, we started researching what was going on in our school district, and that's part of why we left too, among other things. It's developed into other things of just, there's so much opportunity, because Jon actually started receiving trainings we didn't agree with, right? So I looked into the school district we were in, and it was interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with SEL.
Social emotional learning.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm assuming you are. So I went and met with the SEL. A few of us moms went and met with the SEL director, the diversity department, everything. But it was interesting. I was in a meeting and the superintendent got up and said, because of SEL, we didn't have any suicides last year, which immediately I knew wasn't true, Anyway, and all the moms bought it in the room, right? What he said, but I had been researching it, And what's interesting is I was like, well, that's interesting because one, we don't even have an SEL program yet in our high school, so, and it's kind of just being implemented in our elementary, and they haven't really done any assessments on it. So there's really no correlation, right? And every time you ask, give me the research, they don't have, it's just, no, it's doing wonders, but actually, you look at the programs and it's getting worse in the schools. Like Jon even talked to our old, somebody who's at our old junior high, and how many fights are there a day and things like that. And it's interesting because I love in your book, it says sometimes we find what works better and what used to work better, because our schools were a lot more peaceful area before they put these progressive ideas in,
Yeah.
And now they're trying these new programs, which is actually creating more hostile, in my opinion, hostility, and dividing, because it's interesting, even the program they implemented, the diversity department, which I loved what you brought up about technology, because it is actually, they control messages even on these tablets that are being put into these kids. So they started a program, No More, Not Here, in our school district. I don't know if you're familiar with Davis. It hit national news. We've got the DOJ in the school and everything like that. Anyway, but my daughter opened her tablet and her Chromebook, and the message right there was No More, Not Here. And it was this
very first thing that she had
hand
before she could even log in.
And her reaction was, and they were trying to put off include everyone. And this was the reaction our child did, what's this, so it's just these progressive, we've saw it between his trainings and what, and how it's actually hurting these kids and dividing them more,
Yeah.
And
scary
Going
and
back.
frustrating, and you feel like you're up against a behemothic monster that you can't really do anything. You can't hurt it. It's
Yeah.
too big.
Yeah.
But if there's enough of us,
Yeah.
then we can be Lilliputians and bring down the giant. And
Yeah. Yeah.
but
And that's something that I did notice as a principal during the COVID year. Actually, people didn't like the online product that they gave, and they left the schools. And so if you get enough people who just decide, hey, I'm not going to the public school anymore, they start to change what they're doing because that represents money to them. And so and we
boy,
started
that
getting
idea
into
of free
politics and we didn't want to.
enterprise, that can mess up a whole lot of people who don't like to have to be held accountable for the product. But
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
We hope you have enjoyed our conversation with Andrew Pudewa, the founder of IEW. We will conclude our conversation next week. In the meantime, we would love it if you would like and subscribe to our podcast so you can see all of our updates.
Thank you for listening to the Diamond Education Podcast.
You can connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
At Diamond Education, DIMOND, or on our website, diamonded.com.